Chapter 11. Without Property Rights. If there is no God above the state, then the state becomes God. Doug Wilson. Totalitarianism. Ronald Reagan once said, "You cannot control the economy without controlling the people, and when you do that, you have to use violence and coercion." In Chapter 5, we learned about sphere sovereignty and how its structure determines the distribution of power in society. Societies with a strong belief in God and His authority over all spheres, family, church, work, leisure, and government, tend to develop a republican form of government with a bottom-up structure of authority, ensuring that citizens and civil authorities alike will be held accountable to the law and God. But in societies who assert the supreme authority of the state over all realms of life, the sphere of God's sovereignty is also placed in submission to the state. The results of these different structures have produced vast divergences in quality of life, prosperity, and culture. In societies who submit all spheres of life under the authority of God, all activities of life are conducted for the benefit of God, and by extension, all people. As Jesus responded to a Pharisee, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Jesus illustrated how loving God and loving people are inseparable. Because people are image bearers of God, not loving them is the same as not loving God. Societies founded on this principle always tend toward liberty, because God has given humans equal dignity, among whom no one has a greater right to rule than any other. And God acknowledges the dignity of each person by giving them free will to make decisions. He also acknowledges their dignity by holding them accountable to judgment. This theology is the bedrock of the Christian faith as well as republicanism. Republicanism acknowledges the equal dignity inherent in every person and allows them the opportunity to participate in the governance of society in any way they see desirable or are capable. Consequently, anyone can become the leader of society if they can win the support and confidence of the voting public. Pairing this political model with biblical theonomy, the colonists were able to forge a system of governance with a striking resemblance to the covenantal federalism of ancient Israel. This is the republicanism on which the United States was founded. All spheres of life, including the state, are submitted under the authority of God, to whom even the civil leaders are accountable. But in societies who place all spheres of life, including God, under the authority of the state, all activities of life are conducted for the benefit of the state. And the ruler of the state, whose sovereignty has dominion over God's sphere, assumes the authority rightly ascribed to God in matters of morality, family, work, etc. The ultimate goal of the totalitarian state is to replace God, while imposing accountability upon the people and assuming sovereignty over all spheres of life. Consequently, all civil liberties are subject to the will of the state. The results always include arbitrary seizure of property, termination of employment, limits on religious worship, and even the right to life. The totalitarian state always justifies the deprivation of liberties by claiming that it is for the benefit of society, while subjecting citizens to political, economic, and social conditions that make it impossible to dissent or modify the government by vote. The result is a state with absolute control over everything. And although the public may not willfully obey their tyrannical rulers, they are subjected to a system of imposed idolatry as the tyrants take positions of rulers, rather than servants of the people who are themselves accountable to God. When anything or anyone is elevated to a position of authority above God, it is idolatry, and as such, should be rejected. This is the governmental structure of all totalitarian states, including feudalism, communism, and fascism, who share three primary methods of organizing economies and social systems which have epitomized government's willingness to violate natural rights to life, liberty, and property. These ideologies have seduced millions of people around the world to believe the lie that if they surrender their rights, the state will bring about a utopia in which there is no suffering. They promise heaven on earth. But this lie, the kind which salt and light were deployed to expose, intends to replace God as their Lord, provider, and liberator. To reject these idolatrous ideologies, we must be able to identify the 6 common characteristics that exist in totalitarian systems and the common beliefs that enable them. 6 common characteristics of totalitarian states. 1. Dynamic leader. Unites people, symbolizes government, encourages popular support through force of will. This is usually called the cult of personality. A dynamic leader who builds support for their policies and justifies their actions heads all totalitarian governments, and often personifies a higher, transcendent authority. They may even take on an identity as Lord, Savior, Messiah, or parent. 2. Dictatorship and one-party rule. One-party rule that is sympathetic to the grievances of certain segments of the population and hostile to the others. The political party dominates the government by exercising absolute and unquestionable authority. To suppress political opposition, the state will malign, censor, and murder the opposition. 3. Ideology. Sets agendas and goals of the state, glorifies aims of the state, and justifies government action. Goals are typically determined by a response to a crisis. These can be national debt, poverty, war, environment, public health, etc. 4. State control of individuals. Demands loyalty, denies basic liberties, expects personal sacrifice for the good of the state. Tactics include scapegoating and divide and conquer to fabricate conflict between groups of people by blaming national problems on identity groups. 5. State control of society. Regulates all spheres of sovereignty by controlling institutions overseeing business, economics, banking, labor, housing, education, religion, the arts, personal life, and youth organizations. Totalitarian states rely on indoctrination, instruction in the government's beliefs, to mold people's minds. Control of education is essential to glorify the leader and their policies and to convince all citizens that their unconditional loyalty and support are required. 6. Methods of enforcement. Imposing terror, indoctrination, censorship, persecution. Often, the leader utilizes secret police to crush opposition and create a sense of fear among the people. Dictators of totalitarian states use terror and violence to force obedience and to crush opposition. Whereas police are normally expected to respond to criminal activity and protect citizens, the police of a totalitarian state enforce the central government's policies. They may do this by spying on the citizens or by intimidating them. 7. Modern technology. Utilizes mass communication to spread propaganda and advance military weapons. Common beliefs of totalitarian states. 1. Belief that competing political sides aren't willing or capable of cooperating with one another, allowing violent or extremist groups to take over. 2. Belief by the elites that democracy no longer works for them. When those holding power and wealth feel the threat of losing it, they may seek to take over the country by force. 3. Belief by the lower classes that the elite want to oppress them to maintain wealth and power. 4. Belief by the lower classes that improving their economic and social conditions is impossible. 5. Belief that there is a group of people who are the cause for the nation's problems. 6. Belief that only an individual person or singular political force has the solutions to national problems. Feudalism. To say that feudalism was a complex social, political, and economic system would be an understatement. Much like the United States, Europe under the Holy Roman Empire benefited from the common bond of Christianity. The shared religion provided a sense of stability and predictability. While these could be considered desirable qualities which papal fealty awarded Christendom, feudalism as an economic system was deeply flawed. If you were a peasant during this period, you wouldn't have owned the land you lived on. You would have rented it from a baron or duke. You and your neighbors would have combined your oxen to pull a shared plow to till the soil. In this sharecropper system, there wouldn't have been much social mobility, as your parents and grandparents before you likely worked the same land. You wouldn't have even had the right to leave the property without your landlord's permission and paying a heavy tax. Like 21st century globalist plans to eliminate ownership of property and automobiles, you would have owned nothing and been happy. Modern apartment dwellers and employees might compare their circumstances to serfdom, but the freedom to quit their jobs, relocate upon the expiration of their leases, and purchase land of their own gives them immense social and economic mobility that serfs did not have. While some suggest that capitalism creates a neo-feudalism, republicanism protects the rights and liberties of citizens from the deprivation and servitude upon which feudalism relied. Alternately, the economic and social resemblances of feudalism and communism cannot be ignored. Those in power owned the land and means of production while assigning commoners to their duties. Constraints plaguing feudal peasants and communist laborers both emerged from the goal of controlling the masses for the benefit of the state. Legislation without representation has been a primary tactic used by the top-down power structures of feudal, monarchical, and communist systems. Also, like in other totalitarian systems, was the presence of a dynamic supreme ruler. As the dynamic leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope's authority was unquestioned. Consisting of the Church, monarchies and their cascading tiers of princelings, lords, and dukes, the medieval power apparatus maintained the total, centralized control of a one-party rule over every aspect of public and private life. While American republicanism was intended to reject the commingling of public-private partnerships for feudalistic enforcement, modern totalitarian ideologies have nevertheless exploited the private sector to coerce the citizenry, as was apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. In modernity, if a transformation from capitalistic republicanism to a totalitarian system was ever an intended goal, reliance upon the partnership of the government and private industries including social, media, medical, pharmaceutical, energy, transportation, technology, and environmental would be critical to establish unquestioned authority. In the medieval era, this kind of partnership benefited both the church, who received land from the nobles and tithes from the peasants, and the nobles, who obtained religious legitimacy from the church, which ensconced their elite status and guaranteed inheritances to new generations of nobility. As a result, the church owned up to 1/3 of the entire land in Europe during the Middle Ages. By deeding land to abbeys, religious communities made of monks or nuns, the land would be occupied and made productive in perpetuity. Depending on productivity, these abbeys for men or convents for women could become wealthy. Medieval state control of individuals began through social conditioning. To accomplish this, monarchs and the church developed a partnership to institute a system of merit-based salvation. By controlling the religious economy, they could legitimize the divine right of kings and thus control the financial economy. The religious merit economy was a cycle that 1. Imputed guilt for sinning, 2. Granted the power of absolution through confession to priests, and 3. Required sinners to pay penance, which 4. Restored them to a state of grace. This economy was strictly taught and heavily enforced by the church. Penance could take the form of Hail Marys, reciting the rosary, tithing, paying alms, making pilgrimage, self-flagellation, buying indulgences, etc. The monetary forms of penance, such as indulgences and almsgiving, were used to fund the ruling class and were abused in the years leading up to the Reformation. After paying penance, the sinner would go into the world to inevitably sin again, perpetuating the merit economy. The primary method of enforcement under the hierarchy was fear. The church taught that if a sinner died without confessing their sins to a priest, they might go to purgatory where their remaining sins could be purged. This doctrine was the basis for indulgences, which served as an insurance policy to absolve sinners of any unconfessed sins so that they would bypass purgatory. It also preyed upon the guilt of family members who suspected a deceased family member might be trapped in purgatory by convincing them that buying indulgences was the only way to free their loved one's soul. Excommunication was another method of enforcing canon law. Questioning the approved doctrines of the Church, which disproportionately benefited the hierarchy and nobility, was considered apostasy. Any dissent challenging papal authority was punishable by being excommunicated, or in severe cases, by death. Martin Luther fell victim to these methods when he questioned church doctrine. Access to modern technology was granted to the clergy and nobles, who were loyal instruments to the hierarchy. They accumulated wealth by providing services like creating and storing documents, copying charters, and holding valuables. In a highly illiterate society, monks, nuns, and priests were among the few trained in the specialized skill of reading and writing. These services could create significant revenue for the church. Nobles would also send their children to abbeys to be educated, which also served as hospitals. Abbeys benefited the local economy by requiring tradesmen to maintain the buildings and land. In this way, the church maintained a symbiotic relationship with the nobles and monarchy. Because of high levels of illiteracy, as well as the liturgies being given in Latin instead of vernacular languages, commoners were prevented from studying Scripture independently. This lack of access to self-study made commoners completely dependent on the hierarchy for spiritual and religious guidance. In turn, they remained under the complete control of the monarchy. While this economic system would be dissolved by capitalism at the beginning of the Reformation, feudalism would pave the way for an even harsher reemergence of totalitarianism. Communism. Someone once described marriage as two people sitting across a table, each with a bowl of soup in front of them, but holding spoons with ladles so long they could only reach the other person's bowl. Whereas a bad marriage was illustrated as the two people trying to feed themselves in vain and starving as they fumbled selfishly with their spoons, a good marriage was illustrated by the couple who dipped their spoon into the other's bowl and fed them, satisfying both of their needs. This analogy also describes how the attitudes toward the nature of work differ between Christianity and Marxism. In 1848, Karl Marx authored the Communist Manifesto. He criticized capitalism for dividing labor to such a degree that workers were prevented from contributing to society by expressing themselves in their preferred way. He argued that this modern work leads to alienation, or a feeling of disconnection between what a worker does professionally and who they feel they really are. He argued that modern work is insecure and that capitalism makes people expendable. He argued that people are terrified of being treated as gears in a machine who can be replaced on a whim. At the core of the worker's psyche was the fear of abandonment. Marx's conception of work was drastically different from the Reformers' doctrine of work, which cultivated the Protestant work ethic. Whereas Aquinas' celebration of the inward and outward lives proclaimed the honor of vocatio, or calling, which all occupations possessed, Marx viewed unpreferred positions of work as drudgery. Aquinas' attitude toward work was grounded in the Scripture. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord, and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. While Christianity teaches that man was made for work to be done in an attitude of service to God, with a spirit of gratitude, Marxism teaches that work was made for man to serve oneself with an attitude of selfishness. These attitudes stem directly from the theologies of worldviews. Marxism teaches that man is God, and as such, should have his needs served. Marx's theology results in resembling the starving couple trying to feed themselves with spoons designed to feed their spouse. Alternately, Christianity teaches that man is not God, and as such, should serve the needs of others. Applying Christian theology to work life resembles the couple humbly feeding each other and meeting the other's needs. And while Christianity teaches that work is not intended to fulfill the server, but to fulfill the served, the server can find satisfaction knowing that when it is their turn to be served, they also will be served by a server who serves gladly for them. In addition to his incorrect nature of work, Marx also believed that capitalism allowed owners to become wealthy while workers remained poor. He viewed profit as the theft of workers' talent and hard work. For him, capitalism was a fancy word for exploitation. He believed that society could be industrialized to such an efficient degree that the basic needs of every person could be fulfilled. For Marx, the solution to homelessness, poverty, hunger, and even loneliness was communism. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx agreed for a society with no private property or inherited wealth, the imposing of a steeply graduated income tax, a centralized control of the banking, communication, and transportation industries, and free public education. Despite Thomas Hobbes' view of humans as inherently limited in knowledge, wisdom, and virtue, which precluded a solution to social problems like poverty and crime, Marx hazardously echoed Hobbes' advocacy to grant total power to the state. For both men, the centralization of an absolute authority was the only solution to social problems. It was a philosophy that replaced the sovereignty of God with the sovereignty of the state. Preaching that religion was the opiate of the masses, Marx argued that the ruling class manipulated religion to keep the lower classes poor by making them dream about attaining their riches in heaven, making them less likely to revolt. A communist might say that Marx was right about religion when observing the abuses of the medieval Catholic hierarchy. But it wasn't religion that Protestants wanted to escape. It was the government's control of it. Alternately, through Marx's assertion, the state would be granted control over religious institutions, if not the power to abolish them entirely. The teachings of Karl Marx would influence many individuals of the late 19th and 20th century. But despite his efforts, Karl Marx has been described as a doctor who was able to diagnose a disease, but not cure it. It would not be until the 1900s when communism would be tested on a large scale. In the early 20th century, Russia was one of the most impoverished countries in Europe with an enormous peasantry. The last stronghold of feudalism, the Russian Empire was still practicing serfdom well into the 19th century. While the empire abolished serfdom in 1861 by granting citizens influence through organizational freedom, Russia remained largely unindustrialized into the 20th century, which would impact Russians fighting Germany in World War I as they suffered massive losses of life and production. Food and fuel shortages plagued Russia as inflation surged and wealth disparity increased. In response to hardship, communism was imposed in Russia with the October Revolution of 1917. Vladimir Lenin, a member of the Communist Party, had returned from 16 years in exile as punishment for his involvement in a plot to overthrow the king, Tsar Nicholas II. The Bolsheviks were a small but determined faction whose motto was bread, peace, land. As Russia's economic and military crisis deepened, the Bolsheviks increased in popularity. Eventually, they gained a majority in the parliament. Confident in his political popularity, Lenin seized power with the following rationale. It would be naive to wait for a formal majority for the Bolsheviks. No revolution ever waits for that. History will not forgive us if we do not assume power now. On October 25th, the Bolsheviks seized key points around the capital and the headquarters of the government. The next day, Lenin publicly announced the overthrow of the government. The dynamic leader envisioned the Soviet Union as a workers' paradise built on socio-economic equality through the collectivization of the means of production. Anyone living during the early 2020s would see the striking similarities between Lenin's political agenda and those of policies of leftist American politicians. Being the dictator in a one-party system, Lenin encouraged tenant farmers to murder their landlords and promoted violence against the upper classes. Lenin wanted the revolution to be as violent as possible. He also proclaimed the need for every Russian citizen to have rations and used this as a justification for government control of the farms. The agenda of communist ideology resolved to achieve a society without social classes, no private property, and in which each person found fulfillment in desirable work. However, Lenin's vision of an ideal communistic society diverged from Marx's ideal in the realm of work. Out of practical necessity, workers couldn't be allowed to do whatever they wanted like Marx had dreamed. Rather, They were required to work in functions which their economy demanded. Ironically, the alienation which Marx demonized proved unavoidable with the real-world implementation of communism. Despite this contradiction, communist ideology justified forced labor due to the economic conditions incurred by the war, which Stalin said was exploited by the powerful rich, or bourgeoisie. Lenin achieved state control of society by imposing itself over every sphere of sovereignty. To control individuals, farmers weren't allowed to keep the crops they harvested, and their food was redistributed across the country. While many people drew a sense of security from these policies, many others dissented, which was always to their detriment. The communist regime influenced public opinion of the government by controlling education. Much like modern public schools espouse LGBT sympathy, champion transgenderism and gender identity issues, as well as promote diversity, equity, and inclusion doctrines based on Marxist critical theory, everything taught to children was to glorify the communist agenda. Modern technology was used by the state and often denied to Russian commoners. Citizens weren't allowed to travel freely in fear that exposure to free societies may empower dissent. The rapid industrialization of Russia saw the creation of factories where citizens were forced to work. Through a command economy, the government made laws on behalf of the public and methods to enforce them. As the regime forced people to work on collectivized farms, or kolkhozy, the 1930s saw workers resist forced grain requisition. These dissenters were either sent to forced labor camps called gulags or executed. Suspected dissenters could be imprisoned without a trial, and highly scripted purge trials were used to give the appearance of giving political opponents judicial fairness to justify convictions and sentences. Whereas Lenin encouraged the public to protest against their government before he came to power, he suppressed any protest against his dictatorship. Suppressing the free speech of their opponents while accusing their opponents of suppression is a tactic frequently used by totalitarians. Despite his tactics, Lenin's economic theory was proven to be unsustainable when millions of people began to die from drought and famine. For a short period in 1920, he paused communism, allowing farmers to keep the food they harvested and letting them sell the excess for profit. As people were fed, quality of life sprang back with an economic boom. Not unlike a president who revoked mask mandates only to revive them, he reimposed collectivization policies once Russian citizens were appeased. Following the successive rules of Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. This was largely due to the policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost meant relaxing the rules surrounding press regulation and restrictions on freedom of speech, while perestroika involved the decentralization of government, the relaxation of rules on political dissent, and an increased openness with the West. Perestroika as a policy undermined the idea of a one-party state, and increasingly nationalistic sentiments from countries within the Soviet Union became problematic. A combination of nationalistic sentiments, a failure to provide comparable lifestyles to those in Western Europe, and the marginalization of Soviet-sponsored governments led to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's resignation in 1989. But Russia's communist legacy would persist in other nations. Cuba would later repeat the folly of collectivization following the 1959 revolution led by Fidel Castro. The Cuban government first capitulated on its economic ideology by allowing property sales in a 2011 measure, with then broader recognitions of private property under a new constitution in 2018. The purpose of these sweeping changes was to provide protections under law for entrepreneurs and foreign investors. Besides ideological changes towards property rights, Cuba also proposed reforms on term limits and division of power by limiting presidents to 2 consecutive 5-year terms and establishing the office of Prime Minister. The Caribbean nation hasn't been the last communist state to confess the economic and social inefficiencies of totalitarianism. Mao Zedong was born in 1893 to middle-class farmers in the Hunan province of China. Studying politics in university, he became intoxicated with Marxist philosophy, the ends justify the means, which he would later apply to his brutal treatment of the Chinese people. Mao joined the Nationalist Party, who successfully overthrew the monarchy in 1911. Dissolving the monarchy set the stage for the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Paying close attention to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia led by Lenin, Mao became one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party. Through a series of guerrilla confrontations, alliances, and external threats, the CCP took control of the nation under the leadership of Mao. As people began to dissent against his tactics to advocate the interest of rural workers and other economic policies, Mao suppressed their speech by imprisoning and executing them. Re-education camps were built, where many people died. The Great Leap Forward, a Chinese program conceived by Mao Zedong, ended in disaster in 1961. After private farms were collectivized, millions of people were rounded up, trained in agriculture, and assigned to work in communes. In short order, crop and industrial production plummeted, and a famine resulted, causing millions of deaths. Finally, the worsening situation forced the government to reduce the size of the communes, restore family farm plots, and put into place work bonuses and other incentives. After his ideological failure, Mao would resolve to regain control of the party from leaders who had lost confidence in him. In 1966, he would shut down the public schools and encourage students to revitalize the push toward communism in what would be called the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. Mao's failure with collectivization demonstrated the mistake of thinking that people can be motivated to work, produce, or add additional value if they are compensated equally. Every attempt at communism has exposed the unsustainability of the ideology. Both dictatorships were eventually forced to overcome the waves of poverty and oppression with the anchor of capitalistic free market principles. Neither Gorbachev's USSR nor Xi Jinping's China of the 1980s could deliver the prosperity of Western Europe in the form of goods, education, and health without employing the free market mechanisms of capitalism. Without exception, every single nation that has ever adopted communism has eventually reintegrated capitalistic values because the economic incentive provided by capitalism naturally corresponds with human nature. The desire to improve the quality of one's own life, or individualism, is the innate drive of every human being. Communism falsely asserts that people will be satisfied with having a portion of resources that match their basic needs, but this is not true. Even Maslow's hierarchy of needs affirms the nature of humans to excel. If survival was the highest level of existence a person could attain, then no one would work more than necessary to survive. But even Marx admitted that survival wasn't enough for humans. His ideal envisioned a society where people could achieve self-actualization, that is, achieve their dreams. And knowing that self-actualization achieves the highest quality of existence, humans will never be satisfied with mere shelter, food, and water. And in order for people to attain their highest needs, they must first be allowed to exercise their natural rights. Communism gets human nature wrong, which is why economies based on the principles of communism always fail. Fascism. Fascism is a political philosophy created by Benito Mussolini in 1919 based on social Darwinism. The central purpose of fascism is the exaltation and perfection of the state through purifying the genetic and social order of impurities. To achieve the outcome through this method, an autocratic ruler is necessary to force the nation to comply. Ideally, when purification was accomplished, there would be no social classes because everyone who survived would have earned their place in the new order by proving they are worthy of existence. Mussolini was a journalist and former member of the Socialist Party during World War I, but left the party. He was elected prime minister in 1922 and slowly transformed his office into a dictatorship. All fascist parties start as social and political movements before they come to power, relying heavily on the cult of personality, which is the idolization of a ruler. Mussolini was in power 11 years before Hitler and created the model for fascism which the German leader would adopt. While fascism in Germany had differences to the Italian brand, both regimes had common characteristics including corporatism, ultranationalism, and imperialism. Corporatism is the philosophy that capitalism must be controlled by criminalizing unions, strikes, and other labor actions. Ultranationalism is the philosophy that a society is inherently superior to others and uses national myths to rationalize the purging of any defective elements of the society. Imperialism is the philosophy that great nations must demonstrate their greatness by conquering other nations. Following the war, Italy was in the throes of post-war mass unemployment, chaotic political party conflicts, and strikes by socialists and communists. When Mussolini returned home in 1918, the economic and social conditions of his country made it vulnerable to fascist messaging. He organized the Black Shirts, who intimidated and attacked socialists and communists, and expelled them from government positions. Hearing the news of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution 2 years earlier provided anti-communist motivation leading to violence against communist sympathizers, including business people, property owners, and middle-class professionals like teachers and doctors. During a speech before thousands of his supporters in October 1922, Mussolini declared, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome." A few days later, he unleashed his followers on a massive march to Italy's capital city. As tens of thousands converged on Rome, government leaders became so unnerved they resigned. Similar to the empowerment of Canadian, Australian, American, and European police of the 2020s to enforce the policies of the expanded state, the Italian police in 1926 benefited from enhanced powers, which granted them near impunity for their actions. Citizens were subject to surveillance and were encouraged to inform on each other. In its efforts to nationalize the Italian masses, Mussolini claimed to cater to the needs of the workers while rejecting socialism. In practice, the regime favored employers over workers. In response to the economic depression of the 1930s, big businesses enjoyed state intervention to save them from failing, not unlike the bailouts for airlines, banks, and credit card companies which Western companies have experienced in recent financial crises. Although the impact of fascist rule on Italian society varied according to the regime's policies towards specific classes or groups, arguably, the most dramatic consequences revealed themselves to the Italian populace during the latter years of Mussolini's dictatorship. During the war, a series of military defeats and the collapse of the economy laid bare the hollowness of propaganda stressing Italy's invincibility. Mussolini's rule ended on July 25, 1943, when he was voted out of power by his own Grand Council and arrested by police who had been secretly planning a pretext to remove the leader. Unlike his German ideological ally, following numerous military defeats, he had been looking for a way to abdicate his office with dignity. With striking resemblance to the presidential administration of the early 2020s, Mussolini's rule had brought Italy to the brink of military disaster, elevated incompetence to levels of power, and alienated large portions of the population. A similar series of military disasters, incompetence, and alienation was demonstrated with the botched withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan stranding thousands of American civilians, the incompetent handling of overwhelming illegal immigration on the southern border, alienation of most Americans through crippling COVID-19 mandates, skyrocketing energy prices and interest rates, crippling stagflation, and openly hostile rhetoric. When news of Mussolini's arrest was made public, relief seemed to be the prevailing mood. One could foresee the response of most 21st century Westerners resembling that of wartime Italians if granted a similar outcome. Several days before Soviet forces invaded Adolf Hitler's Berlin, Mussolini was shot and hanged by his feet in a public execution. The atrocities and human rights violation by Adolf Hitler and the fascist Third Reich are numerous and well documented. From seizures of civil liberties, property, and occupations to the mass murders of Jews living in Germany during World War II, the Nazi regime was one of the most brutal dictatorships in modern history. Fascist Germany was horrific in its ruthless deprivation of unalienable rights, elevating Adolf Hitler and his co-conspirators to the tyrannical level which Magdeburg confessors would have deemed persecutors of God. And while Nazi tyranny was severe, it was the actions of resistance that stood, face to face, against those persecutors of God, which now draw our attention here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor who lived from 1906 to 1945. While traveling to the United States, he returned to his home country in 1935, explaining that he felt remaining outside of Germany as fascism gained power would be an act of cowardice. He helped run a seminary there until the government closed it in 1937. Bonhoeffer had been targeted by the Third Reich for a comment he made 2 days after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. While lecturing at Berlin University, with an uncommon courage, he publicly denounced on a radio station the Nazi Führerprinzip, which was a synonym for dictatorship. Bonhoeffer adopted the doctrines of Thomas Aquinas and the Reformers, concluding that the Third Reich was a manifestation of tyranny and unrestrained evil against whom righteous men must stand. His continued vocal objections to Nazi policies resulted in his loss of freedom to lecture or publish, and he joined the German resistance movement which plotted to assassinate Hitler. In 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested by the Gestapo, and on April 9, 1945, only a few days before the American liberation of POW camps, was hanged. Bonhoeffer didn't have to resist the fascists. By all accounts, he was a member of the Herrenmenschen, or Master Humans. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed, he could have secured his safety within the Nazi regime if he had pledged his allegiance like so many other Germans did. But, being a Lutheran pastor, he was educated in the Reformed tradition. And his courage to return to Germany was an outgrowth of his religious belief in the sanctity of human life. He believed that all people, regardless of their ethnicity, were image bearers of the living God, his creations, and his property. May we all have the courage to plant our feet firmly on the rock of truth surrounded by the shifting sands of social acceptance, and not be moved by the crushing waves of tyranny. Vigilance. Totalitarian regimes aren't formed in a vacuum. The constant desire for absolute power will attract people like King George III, Hitler, Lenin, and Mao. Similarities between these tyrants are impossible to ignore, and having the ability to recognize the tactics used by dictators can help us to be vigilant against those that are forming in our current circumstances. Ominously, Joseph Stalin once said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." The willingness of tyrants to justify and disregard the consequences of violating unalienable rights should make us passionate for God's sovereignty over our lives. And while our lives may not appear to be in danger at the outset of tyranny, history has demonstrated that any government willing to steal private property will not hesitate to claim ownership of God's property. The claim to possess special knowledge of a solution embedded in the cult of personality is a key element to identifying totalitarian regimes. And tyrants will always proclaim that the solution involves depriving natural rights of an entire group of people. The year 2022 saw vaccine abstainers decline admission to events, venues, businesses, and heard the demands for their relocation to camps. Rulers including the medieval church hierarchy, European monarchs, elected and unelected dictators, and state institutions have always been willing to deprive individuals' rights in the name of a higher good. In the 2020s, the United States witnessed the suppression of natural rights with the emergence of tyranny from surprising sources. Beginning with the deprivation of citizens' natural rights to make decisions about their bodily autonomy, physical location, ability to own property, and how to educate their children, the absolute state seeks to deprive God's sovereignty over the lives of people by replacing him. And totalitarian states of the 20th century have demonstrated the danger of Thomas Hobbes' argument for an absolute monarchy where a king wields supreme and unchecked power over his subjects. Regardless of their title, when a ruler is granted unlimited power, they will become a tyrant. But tyrants do not act alone. When we look at society through a theonomical lens, totalitarianism fills a great need for many people. In the next chapter, we will look at recent human attempts to fill what the French philosopher Blaise Pascal called a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man, and how tyranny inevitably emerges from a society who replaces God by giving complete worshipful obedience to a dynamic leader, government, or institution who promises to save the nation from their problems. In the classic story Anne of Green Gables, Marilla Cuthbert responds to Anne Shirley's temptation to despair by saying, "To despair is to turn your back on God." When nations despair, that is when they allow a totalitarian ruler to insert himself as a savior and idolize the state. In the 2020s, the medieval economy of merit experienced a revival through a new kind of religious hierarchy. We will need to remember everything the reformers have taught us if we are to unmask the idolatrous agenda of the medical priesthood. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.